Squaresoft was an unstoppable RPG powerhouse in the late 90s, and the PlayStation 1 is home to some of the company's most creative works that I think they ever produced. A big part of that is thanks to Hironobu Sakaguchi, the creator of Final Fantasy, who played a huge role in bringing Japanese RPGs to the West. After experimenting with their tried-and-true formula and achieving breakthrough success with Final Fantasy VII, it's easy to see how Square followed that same experimental path with future games in that series to this day. Whether or not you enjoy those modern changes, well, that's not really for this video. But during that mid-90s through early 2000s era, Sakaguchi and Square were far more willing to try out risky new ideas with pretty much all of their IPs, which, of course, brings us to 1998's Parasite Eve. Beginning as this weird Resident Evil Final Fantasy mix, kind of RPG horror hybrid, Parasite Eve is a strange one to say the least, and it really only got weirder and weirder with its stories in the future titles. With a sequel released in 1999 and a spin-off game for the PlayStation Portable about a decade after that, Parasite Eve fans have been somewhat left in the dark as to the future of the series ever since, and it's been almost 10, 15 years now, so what happened? And is Parasite Eve just gone for good? Well, first off, before we get into the secondary games with their cloning, their underground military operations, time travel, and destructible denim jeans, we gotta go back to where it all began, Parasite Eve. Based on a novel of the same name by Hideki Yasuda, the PlayStation 1 game tells the story of Aya Bria, a 24-year-old New York cop who is off-duty, out on a date on Christmas Eve, and with an unnamed date at her side, Aya is looking to enjoy a nice opera performance at Carnegie Hall. The actors seem to be putting on a good show, and that is until the lead actress, Melissa Pierce, begins singing a song. Melissa meets eyes with Aya, and then suddenly, audience members begin bursting into flame all around her. People begin trampling over each other, trying to escape, but as the whole stage is set ablaze, no one makes it out alive. That is, no one except for Aya, who is somehow unaffected? Aya, who is also apparently always strapped with a gun at her side, chases down Melissa, who, we learn through some diary entries, has been very ill and has been taking a whole bunch of medication in order to keep her role in the opera. Once Aya finally does catch up with the singer, it's already far too late. Melissa loses control over herself, and her body begins to go through some monstrous transformations. Melissa's mitochondria have taken over. Yeah, I said her mitochondria. And what the mitochondria want to use Melissa's body for, well, it's pretty messed up. Aya spends the next 5 days uncovering the mysteries behind how Eve came into existence, figuring out why Aya seems to be so connected to her, and of course hunting down Eve and destroying it before she wreaks even more havoc to the city. The game throws you right into the story, and man, what a crazy introduction it is. I noticed that a lot of Square's best games from this era try to get you with a strong hook right from the beginning, and Parasite Eve does that exact thing. The tone is set right from the get-go, and while I wouldn't say that Parasite Eve is the scariest PlayStation 1 game, it does have a very creepy and unsettling vibe, and with some very disturbing and grotesque imagery to go along with it. The game's unique mix of horror and RPG elements really makes Parasite Eve stand out as something special. Even to this day, I think it's an interesting blend of genres that sees very to little no attention. The game was produced by Hironobu Sakaguchi, who outlined the game's story, and this wasn't even his first attempt at bringing the New York setting over to an RPG, as one of the earliest concepts for Final Fantasy VII started off as a detective story in real-world New York. And although this concept was obviously dropped in favor of the story of Cloud and Sephiroth, Square ended up bringing some of these ideas over to Parasite Eve. On a side note, I think it's extremely weird that Square was flirting around with the idea of bringing the real world into Final Fantasy. I just hope they never do that. That'd be so weird. Anyway, but that's aside from the point. Parasite Eve was directed by Takashi Tokita, who previously worked on classic Super Nintendo RPGs, Final Fantasy IV and Chrono Trigger, and I believe it's him who came up with the concept of this being a cinematic RPG, with Parasite Eve showing a lot of influence from films, from 80s buddy action cop movies to horror movies. It's very clear that a lot of the way that this game is presented is inspired by just cinema. One of the first things you'll notice when playing the game is the iconic character designs from Tetsuya Nomura that very much have that 90s anime aesthetic going on. The characters are portrayed in a similar art style to Final Fantasy VII and Final Fantasy VIII, and if you check out some of Nomura's artwork for the game, you'll instantly recognize the style. His design for Eve is truly horrifying, and the concept art for Aya is quite provocative. I guess they told him that this game would be M-rated, and, he really took that to heart. It's also worth noting that Parasite Eve was the company's first mature-rated game that they ever produced, and some of these designs, they really embrace that. The atmosphere throughout the game is mysterious and creepy, and of course a big part of that is from the legendary soundtrack by Yoko Shimomura. There is a lot of cool synth stuff going on. There are some classical sounding piano songs. Some of the songs even feature operatic singing, and the game's ending, holy shit, that song is so good. I've been listening to that one a lot since beating the game, and I just absolutely love this game's soundtrack. Parasite Eve does know when it's appropriate to drop the music to heighten the tension, though. Often, Aya is isolated from, anyone living, and the faint tapping of footsteps is the only sound you'll hear. As far as the environments go, I personally really like them, but it really might depend on how much you appreciate that old pre-rendered art style. For me, oh man, I eat this stuff up. I know I do have a lot of nostalgia for games in this style, but I just think that they've aged a lot better than the fully 3D environments from, the late 90s look. There's a lot of attention to detail that otherwise you just can't pull off. I also really enjoyed the game's use of camera angles, with the occasional creepy fixed shot. You can definitely see that Square was influenced by Resident Evil in this design, but these fixed shots are used more sparingly and used for more tense sections. It's very Resident Evil feeling. It never feels like a direct copy of the style, and as this game has so much less focus on puzzle solving, and luckily Parasite Eve also doesn't have those clunky tank controls, so it definitely feels like its own thing. Parasite Eve actually runs on a modified version of the Final Fantasy VII engine, and after playing them both somewhat recently, I really notice it. Now, one complaint here, and I know that pretty much anybody who's played this game could probably agree on this one, but Aya's movement speed is so freaking slow. It's like she barely moves, and I think they do that to kind of heighten the tension and make things a little scarier. It's not aged very well, and it just seems kind of odd. Combat in Parasite Eve is handled in a really interesting way. It's somewhat of a hybrid between turn-based and real-time combat. Aya has an ATB gauge that fills over time, and once filled, you can pause to input commands such as attacks with your various guns. You can use items, and Aya is even capable of learning some magical abilities that you can use. While waiting for your ATB gauge to charge, you'll have to actively dodge oncoming enemy attacks in real time. And with the regular enemies, for the most part, it's not really anything that you have to go above and beyond to take on, but when it comes to the boss fights, things will get a little bit more tricky, as you'll have to be careful to learn their attack patterns while managing your health and your inventory, and I really liked it. I think this works. You can also customize your armor and your weapons and move various upgrades between them. The upgrade system, it can be a little clunky and weird at times, but once you've figured out how to move abilities between guns, you can end up with some very powerful stuff at your disposal. While it's far from the most advanced combat system out there, it gets the job done nicely. Now, these battles aren't really random, more like they have predetermined areas where they spawn, and as you back travel, the encounter rate seems to shrink down a little bit to steer you away from grinding, and also to help you from getting completely lost if you're an idiot like me. But you really shouldn't have to deal with too much grinding outside of the New Game Plus mode. The game's pacing is really good, but this game is definitely on the shorter side for an RPG. Most people can probably expect to beat it in maybe like 10 to 15 hours, which it sounds short for an RPG, but it's a pretty typical length when compared to horror games on the PlayStation 1. Parasite Eve also doesn't have a lot of fluff, so outside of a single optional area, the game's locations are always advancing the main story. It's quite linear, and again, you gotta remember they were going for a cinematic take on RPGs, so it is exactly that. It's got about the length of a movie's worth of story wrapped up in it, and I think enough gameplay in it to stretch it out without ever overstaying its welcome. If anything, by the time you beat the game and have a full grasp of all the different game mechanics, it's over. There is, however, like that mentioned, that new game plus mode where you can continue to exploit the game's mechanics and take on additional challenges in the form of the Chrysler Building, where you can eventually fight your way to a secret ending that is probably the best ending that I ever had, but is ultimately not really canon when you take into account Parasite Eve 2 and the Third Birthday. So yeah, if you're someone who is into old school PlayStation 1 horror games, RPG games, I really can't recommend this game enough. But what happened to the series after this one? Well, let's start with the game's sequel, Parasite Eve 2, which was released just a year later, but in typical Square fashion, changed a whole bunch of the mechanics around. This game, while it does carry a lot of the same spirit of the original, had a completely different team of people making it, and I think it's really apparent. With Parasite Eve 2, they brought in Kenichi Iwao to direct and write the sequel. Iwao was known for his work writing 1996 Resident Evil, so you can immediately see why he'd be a good fit for the role, but you can also see why this game feels even more like a Resident Evil game than a Parasite Eve game. It just hits so differently. And it's not really to say that Parasite Eve 2 is a bad game. I actually do like it quite a bit. In some ways it does manage to make some improvements on the gameplay, especially with its parasite powers, but I still think it really lost a lot of what made the first game feel unique. And then there's the story. For as weird as the first game was with its mitochondria stuff, I think this is where things start getting really out of hand, as the game completely deviates from the original. It's all original from here, and the shit just gets weirder and weirder. We're talking secret government operations, we're talking cloning, and you know how in Parasite Eve 1 all of the neo-mitochondria monsters are animals? Well, now it's affecting humans too. Sounding familiar? Well, that's because this game really wants to be Resident Evil, going as far as downgrading the control scheme to fit that classic tank style used in Resident Evil and stuff like that, and they brought along annoying puzzles to go along with it. So, again, I'm not saying that Parasite Eve 2 is bad, because it's really not. I actually did like playing it. I have not beaten it yet, but I'm getting pretty far in it, and despite being frustrated with the controls, it's pretty fun. It's not going to appeal to the same people that Parasite Eve 1 appeals to. And if you prefer more of the RPG stuff like me, this maybe won't do it for you. But if you like the Resident Evil side of Parasite more, well, then you might actually even end up liking Parasite Eve 2 even more than the first one. I don't know, the vibes are just kind of different, and when I read that Parasite Eve 2 was originally planned to be a spin-off from the original game featuring Kyle as the main playable character from the beginning, then was reworked into this, you can see why it was going to be a very different game from its inception. But now that we've made it to the topic of spin-offs, we have to address the Third Birthday. Not officially named Parasite Eve 3 to avoid copyright issues, this game came out about 10 years later, but only for the PSP, and it also really rubbed a lot of fans the wrong way. Now, I'll say, this is a game that I passed on, and I have not played it yet. I was planning on playing it before I made this video, but guys, unfortunately, I ran out of time, and I wanted this video to come out in October still. Luckily, there is this thing called YouTube, so I did watch an entire playthrough of the game, and, I mean, it looks fun, and from what I hear, the gameplay is pretty fun. But once you start paying attention to what they do with these characters, and once you watch the ending of the game, if you're a fan of Parasite Eve, there's no way you are not going to be frustrated by this. The story is bullshit. It's just bad. It's bad fan fiction. Whoever came up with this, no good. No good. So I don't want to go too heavy into spoilers here, but for anyone to understand this game, they kind of already expect you to know what's going on with the ending of Parasite Eve 2. So I mean, I'll be as gentle with these spoilers as possible. But if you don't want to know, skip ahead like maybe 30 seconds or a minute or so. This is your last chance. In Parasite Eve 2, Aya is part of a special team that hunts down artificial NMCs created by a shadow government. Towards the end of the game, Aya discovers a familiar little girl who ends up being a clone of Aya named Eve Brea. And remember that guy Kyle I mentioned? Well, okay. I guess the implication is that Aya and Kyle help Eve escape and basically raise her. Now, I'm not really sure, like a daughter, but maybe more like a younger sister. Now, in the third birthday, fast forward about 10 years, the story takes place in 2013. New York is being attacked by monsters, and Aya, who conveniently has amnesia, but because of her new ability to jump between souls, she's the best suited to take on these things. So, throughout the game, we learn that this Aya isn't Aya at all, but rather it's Eve, not the Eve from the first game, but this new Eve, who's trapped inside her body after an assassination attempt on Aya and Kyle at their wedding night goes wrong. So, as Aya is dying, Eve jumps into her body, and actually, okay, I'm gonna stop myself there. If you love Parasite Eve, and you want to be frustrated, just go read a synopsis of the game's ending, because, yeah, Jesus, what is that? What is that? This story is a convoluted mess at best, and a slap to the face of the fandom at its worst. Not to mention the creepy implications of having the underage Eve trapped inside Aya's body, as this game goes above and beyond in sexualizing the living hell out of Aya. I mean, Eve. We'll just call her Aya for the sake of this video. Aya Brea was always originally designed to have a certain amount of sex appeal, but she's never, not exactly like this. Aya is sexy, but she's never sexualized inside the games. In the third birthday, Aya literally gets her clothing blown off in combat, when she's running around nearly naked and constantly moaning while being shot at, and, well, hey, I'm not necessarily advocating against this kind of stuff. Maybe keep it to, Senran Kagura, or whatever it's called, and keep that out of Parasite Eve, please. It just feels super out of place. You know, I'm playing these kind of games for scary stuff, for some creepy stuff, for some weird stuff, but not weird like this. So I think when you take into account this super sexualized version of the character who's not even the character, put her in a game that doesn't play or even really look anything like Parasite Eve, and name it something entirely different, it's pretty easy to see why this game didn't have the same appeal, not to Parasite Eve fans, but probably not really to anybody. The gameplay is switched up once again, and this time going for more of an action-based third-person shooting style, and for the PSP, it looks like they did a pretty good job here. But again, is this where the fans wanted the series to go? I would say probably not. Maybe it could have worked if the story wasn't also complete nonsense. I do understand how this game came to be, but I'm just left bewildered that this is the best that they could come up with. Despite not owning the rights to the name Parasite Eve, Mitochondria Eve, or anything that really goes back to the novels, Square Enix still had the rights to the original characters, such as Aya, Kyle, and anything from Parasite Eve 2. So in order to avoid issues with copyright, this is what we got. Now, the game was always supposed to be a spin-off, and maybe not intended to be taken as seriously as the other two games, but unfortunately, when there are no other games in the series to explore, to most people, this is Parasite Eve 3, and for the series to end here with some random PSP action game featuring, and I use that word lightly, featuring Parasite Eve characters, it really sucks to see this as the way it went. Now, in the modern day, none of these games have been remastered yet, nor are they available to download on the PlayStation 4 or the PlayStation 5. And to me, it seems like the series maybe lost too much steam to really have a full revival. It's kind of disappointing, because I do think that Parasite Eve accomplished some really special things, but as they lost sight of what people probably wanted to see out of it, and the series just started copying other stuff, maybe they dug their own grave. But let's never say never. While remasters would be nice, we're living in an era where remakes and reboots run rampant, and I can't think of many other Square Enix franchises that have so much potential for a remake. The problem would be, did Square Enix's treatment of the series scare off too many fans? Would the author of the novel even let them use the Parasite Eve name anymore? Well, over the last couple years, we've seen some promising signs. This year, Aya Bria made an appearance as a playable character in the mobile game Final Fantasy Brave Exvius. While I love Parasite Eve, and I love Final Fantasy, mobile games really aren't my thing, so I have not checked this out myself. But I was surprised to see not only the use of Aya Bria, and she's kind of depicted as she is in Parasite Eve 1, it seems like they also reference Mitochondria Eve, so I don't know, maybe Square Enix kind of are on good footing with the author, and maybe we might see more. Or maybe it was just a quick paycheck. It's kind of hard to say at this point. What I would like to see, maybe just remake the original game. You know, that's usually the one I see that gets the most attention anyway, and then they can just kind of ignore the sequels and the third birthday. And seeing how the original Parasite Eve was made with the Final Fantasy VII engine, imagine Parasite Eve playing on a modified version of the Final Fantasy VII Remake engine. Honestly, the combat systems are quite similar, with their blending of real-time dodging and the filling of an ATB gauge to pause and input spells and attacks. Yeah, I know that's extremely wishful thinking on my end, but I could see a Parasite Eve remake being extremely successful if done right. It's gotta be scary, and it's gotta be good, but look at Capcom and its Resident Evil remakes. Hell, we are even getting a remake of Silent Hill 2 now. So, I mean, we all know that Square Enix loves to follow trends, so hopefully they noticed this one and they're getting on it, but, you know, in time we'll find out. But anyway, that's what I would do. And I certainly hope it's not just gone for good, because Parasite Eve is such a unique franchise for the company to build upon. They just need to make sure that they treat it with the respect that the characters deserve. Anyway, that's the end of the video. Hit the like button if you liked this, and if you didn't like it, well, you can hit the... Peace.